This is Module 5, and we're going to be talking about systems. So far, I've begun the discussion around this new appraisal method by making an assertion. Adjustments cannot be supported in isolation. And, uh, and I've gone through some examples to explain that. And I've talked about how we're actually bringing in a lot of things uh, through our decisions and through the tools that we use. And I was talking about determinism and both in me choosing a type of analysis um, or even choosing a specific adjustment factor that's going to influence something else. And I'm talking about those mutually influenced uh, interactions as part of a system. Well, let's talk a little bit more about that because uh, when we're creating a model, so I've also talked about that sales comparison approach is just a hedonic valuation model, and talked about sort of that the problems inherent with dealing with measuring pleasure. So we want to really spend a little bit more time talking about those models and really the systems that they're supposed to represent. So what do I mean by system? So by system, what I mean is the shape of a market and the shape of the data and how they combine. So last time I talked about shape. We were talking about interdeterminacy and how there's some actual organic interplay between how market participants, real people, perceive different property elements. And sometimes those elements impact one another. And then I talked about how, well, data itself has a shape and how we can measure that shape in some really helpful ways, like through correlation. But ultimately, those types of interdeterminacy are really impacting the system as a whole, because the system is the combined nature of a market and then how we're able to perceive that market. We're only able to perceive the market through data. And so the data itself is not the market, it's just the means through which we perceive it. And we really want to understand the market, but we can't separate those two. They're inseparable. And by inseparable, what I mean is that we can't isolate any particular variable very well. That's the whole point of interdeterminacy. They're too intertwined, either structurally through the way that our data is composed, or organically through the way that the market behaves. Um, we can't just decide to pull apart a market in a particular way and have that be reflective of actual market behavior. That's us introducing determinism, and um, we're actually actively shaping the market. So I've got an example here that will help us to maybe understand the system and how we can't really, we're sort of circling back around to the beginning now that we have a little bit more framework. So let's talk about what it would look like to uh, to isolate an adjustment factor in a system. So what you see on the screen is a slide from a presentation I gave a couple of years ago. And during the course of this presentation, I analyzed a the same set of data several different ways and got several different results. So this is just a simple graph which shows price versus gross living area. And you can see that I've got a linear trend line through this data, and that linear trend line is going to tell us, hey, here is the coefficient for the gross living area. So one additional unit, one additional square foot of gross living area impacts price at $195. That is the formula for this trend line. And you can see it's sort of obvious when you just look at the scatter plot there that, yeah, they're obviously moving together this isn't any big shock to any of us. But let's look at what happens when I make a change to the system. So this is the same exact set of data, filtered exactly the same way, but I am actually adjusting for 5 different elements. So I'm actually here changing the structure of my system in terms of what is implicit in this number. So you can see the coefficient for gross living area changed quite a bit. And the reason that it changed is because there are lots of other elements that are influencing gross living area. And so when I adjust for those other elements, the gross living area will change. Now, what we need to understand, if I back things up and we're looking at this system, if I were to pull that 195 out of the system, I'm actually pulling a lot of assumptions with that. And the assumptions are that none of the other variables matter. We're adjusting for all the other variables implicitly at 0. So that's important because I can't pull this 195 out of this system and apply it in a system where I'm not holding every other factor at 0. Because this 195 only has meaning within the system from which it was calculated. So once we make these adjustments, I'm saying I don't think 0 is an appropriate number, and I'm going to adjust for these other variables at a different rate. So I've done 2 things. Number 1, I've changed this, but how have I changed that? I've changed it actually by determining that these other adjustments are better. Are they? Maybe, maybe not. I would say they were, but how do we know? And still, if we all agreed, hey, I think you're probably right, your adjustments are probably great. Okay, well, what can I do with this 152? Because if I pull the 152 out of this system, what am I also pulling out? I'm pulling out every adjustment that I made for every other element that I adjusted for. And still, there are other things that I didn't consider yet. So here I've actually filtered the data a little bit more. I'm still adjusting, and but I've been a lot more selective about how I'm filtering. So now I've actually got a different subset of data. So my data is different here, but I'm still trying to reflect the same market. But again, look, I've got a different number again, and that's because my system has changed. And so I have to realize that anytime there's an analysis, so this is a regression analysis, but the same would apply if you're doing a paired sales analysis, any sort of cost-based analysis or a grouped analysis. What you're really doing is you're deriving a number that exists within a system. And so we really need to ask ourselves, can I apply that to this other system? If I say I can, what I'm implicitly saying is that I believe that my system that's reflected for my subject property and my sales comparison is identical, both organically and structurally, to the system from which I've derived this number. It's highly unlikely that that is the case. So if for no other reason, then the data set is different. So if I'm using a set of data that's, say, 5 sales, maybe it's even 5 sales out of the ones here, well, the 5 sales are going to represent a slightly different structure than the, 40 sales that we see on the screen represented right now. So what do we do with this? because what I'm doing is setting up sort of an impossible bar. It's impossible because we've been doing things in a way that we've either been ignoring some of the things that I'm trying to shine the light on in terms of things that we're bringing in terms of maybe different assumptions, different deterministic frameworks, either from us uh, as as analysts, as appraisers, or maybe that there's a deterministic framework that we're overlaying by the use of a particular technique. So in this example right here, I have chosen a linear trend line. Well, that is a determination of a framework that's going to have a particular calculation. If I were to go back and take the same data set and choose a different type of trend line, I'm going to get a different formula and a different result. And so uh, what I've done is a sort of created a problem for us, in that if we're honest about the difficulty of actually modeling a real estate market accurately, and a difficulty of dealing with, well, if I've got an infinite number of solutions within my system, and you're saying I can't deterministically bring in a solution from outside of my system, then how can I support my analysis? And so that's exactly the dilemma that I want to create, because that's exactly the dilemma that I was met with when I started uh, to look for solutions to this problem. And so as we move forward, I'm going to be trying to help you to see how to uh, evaluate different solutions, and ultimately how to apply a solution that works.